Okay, while individual presidential candidates were seeing that the South was a valuable place to pick up electoral college votes, there hadn't been a real systematic way that the Republican Party was approaching it for down ballot tickets, and Newt Gingrich really changed that. So in the Republicans had been in the minority in the House since 1952, and there hadn't been any real serious challenges by the party to Democratic control. Um, Gingrich believed that the existing leadership was too accommodationist, that they were satisfied kind of keeping the Democrats from becoming too liberal rather than advancing their own ideological positions. And because of this, he saw a real option to nationalize the election. So, Democratic Speaker Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker from the 70s through the 80s, he had a famous dictum that all politics is local, and he told that people running for Congress, to focus on their local issues. Don't talk about Russia. Don't talk about, national environmental policy. Don't talk about national environmental policy. Talk about the pollution in your river. That localize everything. Um, Newt Gingrich did exactly the opposite. He nationalized everything. So people in places, people in the South were voting on things that only mattered. They were motivated by issues that didn't really affect them. And Newt Gingrich was able to kind of turn Tip O'Neill's dictum on his head. That he said instead of all politics is local, he said all local elections are national. And we're still living with that kind of idea today. Um, he the In 1994, the Republicans under Newt Gingrich's leadership took control both of the House and Senate, but also picked up governorships and state legislatures all across the country. And this then provided an impetus for Democratic elected leaders to formally change parties. Whereas you had the Democrats for Nixon and you had Democrats supporting Ronald Reagan, they didn't actually change parties. After the Republican Revolution of 1994, the Democrats started changing parties formally. So Richard Shelby was a senior senator from Alabama. He changed parties the day after the election. The election was on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, he formally changed parties. In the 1995, the year of 1995, five House of Representatives members changed parties. All of them were Southern Democrats, but it wasn't just Southern Democrats who were switching. There were others around the country who were. And so, for instance, Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell from Colorado changed parties after it, and Campbell was pretty much a moderate, and he saw, well, if Republicans are in control, I'm going to be able to advance the things that matter more to me if I'm in the majority party, and he was able to do that because there have been so many other people changing parties in this time. So you have really, for the first time, a real partisan realignment, despite the fact that you've had these kind of a whole century of conservative Democrats in the South. So let's take a look at what made this possible, what made Newt Gingrich possible at this time. So in 1988, Tip O'Neill served his final term in Congress, and he leaves. And Tip O'Neill's era was one of the great congressional eras. I mean, he worked across the board. He worked in a bipartisan manner in the House of Representatives. He had Reagan were golfing buddies. I mean, he got along with everyone. When he left, the Democrats replaced him with Jim Wright from Texas. So Jim Wright becomes Speaker, and Wright was far more partisan in general, and some would even say power hungry. And this led to a real opening. I mean, there were some really dissatisfied Republicans. Gingrich then, I mean, dissatisfied, yeah. Gingrich then used this as an opening, and he hurled all kinds of accusations against Jim Wright. He lobbed an accusation that the speaker had slept with underage teenage pages, and that he had committed all kinds of ethics violations. The one that ended up sticking was that he had that the right had used a $60,000 book deal, basically to avoid outside income limits. That basically one person bought all $60,000 worth of books, and it was basically a transfer in the way of book sales, because book sales were allowed, revenue from book sales were allowed, but other kinds of outside income was not. Wright becomes the first speaker to ever face get reprimanded by Congress, and this would change the dynamics. And he realized that he could use the media, and he could use these kinds of aggressive techniques to win political points. Ironically, Gingrich would then be ousted as Speaker just a few years later. In 1999, he ended up getting pushed out of the Republican Party, or of the Republican leadership, and having to resign his seat because of ethics violations. Another thing to look at in this period is the role of the media. And we are not talking about Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and all of that. What we're talking about is C-SPAN and cable news. So C-SPAN gets started in the early 1980s, and some kind of bombastic Republicans are able to use it in a very strategic way. So on the C-SPAN had its cameras going whenever the House was in session. Was a long-standing tradition of being able to make speeches whether or not the House was full or not. And so what people like Gingrich and Orange County Congressman Bob Dornan did was they took advantage of this by on Friday afternoons, when the House was technically in session but nobody was actually there, making speeches on the floor of the House specifically to get on C-SPAN, and people were watching him and cheering him on, and it kind of changed the dynamics. The other thing that changed was that we have CNN doing a 24-hour news cycle. And if you've got 24 hours worth of news, you can't say the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, you don't want to create new news. Even though they would repeat the headlines, they'd want they'd want to break new news several times a day. And one of the ways you did this was by bringing on some of the lesser congressmen who were just happy to have FaceTime. Gingrich took advantage of this. He proved to be an excellent TV guest, as far as making kind of news, making drama, and things like that. And so, way before Fox News became the powerful conservative slash Republican influence, there were Republicans taking advantage of a changing media landscape. When you think about Newt Gingrich, you think of two things. You think of the contract with America and his ability to inject conservative ideas into consideration by the legislature. But his revolution was not just ideological. It wasn't just that we now have conservative ideas being considered. It was also tactical and a shift in tone. Um, he and his contract ran against the Washington insiders. He had this that Washington is the problem, and you need to clean house. As Trump would say, you need to drain the swamp. Newt Gingrich really established that anti-Washington attitude in the electorate. Here are some examples of that. First of all, he said that they were going to apply laws to Congress. So if you had to have fire escapes in your business in South Dakota, you're going to have fire escapes in Congress and things like that. If you had to pay overtime in South Dakota, you'd have to pay overtime in Congress. And so that was one way. It was a very substantive policy way that they could do it. They advocated for term limits, and saying that people go to Washington and they get too comfortable and they forget the folks at home. So we're gonna consider term limits legislation, and we're gonna personally promise that we won't spend more than 3 years or 5 years or 3 terms or 5 terms or whatever in Congress. Um, and then they promised that they would be back in their districts every weekend, that they wouldn't become Washington insiders, that they would come home and talk to the people every single weekend. To that extent, Congress moved from a 4 or 5 day schedule to a 3 day schedule every week, so that people could be back in their districts. He also kind of pioneered a style of partisan combat that's very familiar to us today. He put forward a whole bunch of conspiracy theories, one of which was Hillary Clinton killed Vince Foster, who was her former law partner and an official in the Clinton White House. If you're interested in any of these kind of conspiracies, Google Clinton body count, and you can just go down a rabbit hole. Apparently, Hillary Clinton is responsible for over 200 deaths, personally responsible, not like sending people to war or whatever. Use a lot of name calling, and we see this today in Donald Trump's politics extensively. He also kind of pioneered the idea of obstructionist tactics. The first one was the government shutdown. The government had run out of money before, and the government had not finished their budget on time before. But it was they had always just do a continuing resolution, or I mean, the government did not come to a halt when there were budget issues to resolve. That changed with Newt Gingrich. He stopped the government. He said we're not funding anyone who's not absolutely essential will go home. We don't know if they'll get paid, and kind of used that to force the hand of Clinton on the budget. And so this kind of using the powers of the legislature to change things in a way that was obstructionist rather than creative was important. Another example of this is the Clinton impeachment. There were a lot of Democrats at the time who thought that um, whether or not Clinton did anything wrong, it didn't rise to something that should consume the nation the way it did. And so we also see that there is a huge focus on campaign fundraising, and that congressmen begin to spend an extraordinary amount of time raising money, dialing for dollars. And so all of these are kind of things that change that Gingrich introduced, but are very, very much a part of our political landscape today.